I am super excited. Maria Noel Groves is joining us today from New Hampshire. Maria is a local herbalist. She's also a journalist by training. She's been coming to MCPHS for the past several years, more than several, close to 5 years, right? And I absolutely love her teaching style and how much knowledge and information and practical skills and practical tools and tips and tricks that she shares during her presentations. She has two amazing books. I know that one of her books is in your syllabus, so I know a couple of you have purchased it and hopefully are enjoying it. I know that Maria will mention her books a little bit later on for those of you that are not familiar with them. And today we are talking about the immune system, which is very, very timely, very appropriate. And I'm super excited about this presentation. So hopefully all of you guys are as well. Maria, welcome.
Thank you so very much. I'm excited to be here. And apparently I cannot, because of the settings, I cannot record on my end. So I might take you up if you're okay with sharing the recording. I'll take you
Absolutely.
up on that. But thank you guys so much for having me. This is definitely a pertinent topic. Probably would have been useful to have like a year ago. Actually, I think we did do a talk like this about a year ago. And we're dealing with things in our own household now. So we're putting a lot of these tips into practice currently. But, I love the topic of herbal immune empowerment because there are a lot of things that we can do naturally to support our immune system for common respiratory infections. And even if they're not going to guarantee that we don't get an illness or, guarantee that an illness goes in a particular direction, it does nudge things in our favor. And modern medicine, with the exception of things like vaccines, really doesn't have a whole lot of great answers for colds and flus and other common respiratory infections, but we have a long history of use of natural remedies and foods and herbs. So I'm going to just kind of dive right in here and get into the slides. And let's see, I actually have a clicker so I don't have to, should work. So I'm curious too. Feel free to pop in the chat box. I will do my best to keep an eye on it. In fact, on that note, I should open up the chat box so I can see. But I'm just kind of curious, since I don't know all of you, where you are located currently, where you call home. I'm gonna guess that from past working with folks from the school that we have folks all over the world, as well as some of you who are actually in Massachusetts and folks from all over the world. So I'm just kind of curious where you're from, and then how have herbs touched your life? So, how have you interacted with plant medicine? Maybe it's significant, maybe it's not significant, but I'm just curious and would love to see that in the chat. And Lana, if you do have the chance to send me a copy at the chat, because I may not be able to read everything as we, go through, but I'd love to take a look at it afterwards. And let me just kind of peek at that. So we have a lot of folks who are in New England, which is cool, because I think last time we did this, we had folks kind of scattered across the world. So awesome. So let's see if I can get this. Click. And then just a little bit about me. I'm not going to get too in depth into it because I really want to spend as much time as we can talking about our topic and about herbs. But my focus of my business is really all about education and empowering people at herbal medicine. So I don't sell products. That's not the focus of my business. It's teaching, seeing clients, although I am doing a lot less of that these days just for a lack of time. Teaching is taking up quite a bit of my time these days because there's a lot of interest in herbal classes. And then the other thing that I do is I write about herbs. So I have my two books, Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies. And they're just really nice starter to intermediate herbals, especially Body into Balance goes into different body systems and how to use herbs for the systems to bring them into a better state of balance. So, here's the immune system, here's how it should work, here's how it can get out of balance. And then here are herbs and diet and lifestyle suggestions to bring things back into balance. That's more or less how that book is structured. And then Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies is also organized by body system. So, the immune system, the respiratory system, the digestive system, nervous system, stress, relaxation, that kind of thing. And then focusing on really easy to grow herbs and what kinds of remedies you can make with those herbs so that you can plant a garden that's specific to your own personal family health needs. So those are the two books that I have. And thank you guys so much for, including where you're from. It's great to see. And oh, we got somebody from Dedham. My family is from Dedham. Half of my family is from Dedham. I used to live in Jamaica Plain too when I was out working for Natural Health Magazine. So let's see, my website is wintergreenbotanicals.com, and I have so much information on there for free. And so you can definitely check that out, especially if you go under the Learn More tab that's on there. Then you can get to the blog and virtual herb walks and recordings of podcasts that are available for free and a few free videos. And so you can check that out if you're interested in learning more about herbal medicine. And then just some basic safety rules. I like to start all my classes like this just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm not a doctor, so I can't diagnose or prescribe in general. But, when I see clients, we look for patterns and we come up with a game plan. So there's a little bit of a semantics as well as a legal definition there. But in this particular lecture, I really don't know your personal history. And so this really is just general education information. And then you're going to want to decide how and whether or not it's appropriate to apply it to your own life. So you could consider hiring a herbalist or naturopathic doctor to guide you, especially if you have a really complicated case. That can sometimes be helpful. You could decide to self-treat, but it's always a good idea to keep your doctor in the loop and, maybe even your pharmacist and other medical care folks that you have as part of your team, just to make sure that you're on the right path with the herbs. Doctors usually don't have training in how, whether or not the herbs would have benefit and how to use the herbs, but they should still be kept in the loop. And they're sometimes our best places for diagnosis and assessment. And there are certainly times where modern medicine is the most appropriate course of action. If you are going to be doing self-treatment, which is kind of what this class is about and what most of my books and classes are about, it's good to keep a few safety rules in mind so that you do it in a very empowered and educated and safe way. So I recommend researching a new herb in at least 3 different resources. And I have a lot of recommended reading books and websites on the links page and on the recommended reading page of my website just to get you started. And I like to include a mix of sources that are written by herbalists primarily, because we usually have a lot better understanding of the nuances of the herbs. But then I do also like to include some of this evidence-based scientific data as well, so that we have that perspective. And in my regular classes, I find that my students are often really challenged with the science and the evidence-based, and they really gravitate especially to the herbalist written. And the herbalist written information usually is just a lot more meaningful and just it's a little less myopic than the science-based. But I would guess that you guys, being pharmacy students, might actually be a lot more comfortable working in the evidence-based world. And so if that's kind of what you've been referring to for resources, then I encourage you to include some of those herbalist written sources in your repertoire as well, so that you can see how that information compares and contrasts. And I love getting a variety of perspectives, because no one source is going to have all that information. And especially when we get to today's topic of the immune system and respiratory system support, there are studies out there for some of these topics, and some herbs are studied very well. Some herbs are not studied almost at all. Sometimes the study, in the case of echinacea, there are tons of studies, but they're super contradictory, where some find it helps, a lot find it doesn't help. And, there's just a lot of confusion when you look at that research. So it's nice to pair that with the traditional understandings of those herbs and the clinical experience of herbalists, so that you can put that into a little bit broader context. Number 2 is to listen to your body and your intuition. And so with any, for any reason that you're taking herbs, tune in and see how it feels when you take it. Like, do you feel good or not good when you take it? Usually in most cases, if you don't feel good when you take an herb, it's not the right herb for you. There are sometimes exceptions to that, but as a general rule of thumb, that's pretty true. And so there might be a different herb that's better suited for you. And some people also really are in touch with plant spirit medicine and their intuition as a way to access herbal information and determine what herbs are right for you. So that might be dowsing, it might be getting answers through prayer, it might be just kind of standing with your herbs and like seeing which one just you're gravitating towards. And I think that's really useful too. But I like using a combination of everything. So, having done your research, but then also letting your intuition guide you. And then ultimately, how does your body feel when you take it? Because how your body responds is the most important thing of all. Number three, if you are doing any wild crafting or harvesting, that's a beautiful thing with herbs, is that you can just go out into the wild or go out into your garden, harvest something and take it. And that's usually the most potent and meaningful herbal medicine of all. But it's now on you to make sure that you have correctly identified the plant. And so, that's a whole course in and of itself, is identifying your plants, but it's just something to remember to make sure that you've done properly. And then last but not least, if you are on pharmaceuticals, it's a good idea to double check for herb drug interactions. You folks being pharmacy students probably are pretty well versed or in the process of getting very well versed on all of this information. And for the everyday person, I often recommend that they ask their pharmacist. And even though most pharmacists can't advise as far as what people should or shouldn't take, they can at least look things up and may have the training to say, you know what, these things may interact. So it might not be a good idea to take the two of them together, even if depending upon the pharmacist's role, they may not be able to say, oh yeah, go ahead and take, this herb instead, but they can at least usually advise. And if somebody does hire an herbalist or a naturopathic doctor, we usually do have the education to advise safe use of herbs alongside pharmaceuticals as well. And then always keep your doctor in the loop, whether or not the doctor is able to really advise properly on herbs and herb drug interactions, we're all a team and we should be communicating with one another and respecting one another. So in addition to my basic, safety rules that I do at the beginning of any class, I wanted to throw a few extra ones, because even though this class is a little bit more about the cold and flu, we can't help but be thinking about the current pandemic and COVID. And I wanted to address that a little bit more straight on. So, the things that we're talking about are things that are traditionally used in herbal medicine for the cold and flu. And a lot of things probably do apply to COVID to some extent, and coronaviruses in general for sure. But, COVID is much more complicated than a traditional cold or flu. There's a lot we still don't know. It can sometimes get really quite severe and escalate very quickly. And it has its own sort of set of unique complications, especially in individuals. It's just really different, even from person to person, and how it might affect them. And some of those things, kind of fall into line with typical cold and flu type symptoms. And then others are really quite different, like around blood clots and diarrhea and things like that are very different from how we generally view colds and flus. So it would be really different approaches there. And of course, COVID, like the cold and flu, but especially on its own, is much more deadly. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. And I have been following the COVID crisis as well as herbs and natural approaches to COVID, but I'm not an expert, and really, like, none of us are, but I in particular, I'm not an expert, and I don't generally work with clients with COVID in my practice, because my practice is not set up for that kind of urgent acute care response. I have a lot on my plate and I have to compartmentalize different days for different tasks, and that just doesn't work if you have somebody with an acute situation like COVID. So that's not my level of experience, even though at least theoretically, I have some understanding of things. And when it comes to research, when it comes to the cold and flu, we have some evidence, and a lot of it is mixed. And when it comes to COVID, I am not aware of any herbal clinical, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials that have currently been completed. There are several underway for mushrooms and elderberry and other things, but I don't know of any that have actually been completed. So we have no data, scientifically speaking, at least, to say whether or not these things will or won't work for COVID. But we do have a lot of anecdotal information from various herbal practitioners across the country and the world. So let's jump into basic immune support and coming from the point of view of prevention. So nothing is a guarantee, but the goal here is that hopefully, if you do get exposed to a common infection, whether it's COVID or the cold or the flu, if you've been doing your due diligence and taking care of yourself, you may be less apt to catch it, or what you catch might actually be a little less severe or a little bit shorter in duration, but nothing is ever guaranteed. And probably you will still catch it, but the hope is that from the evidence that we have is that it might be less severe and shorter duration as well. So why do we get sick? We've got the germ theory, and then we've got the terroir or the terrain theory, the host theory. So is it that the germs are out there and that's why we get sick? Certainly that's part of it. If there were no germs, we wouldn't get sick, but we're always exposed to germs, especially in normal times when we're out mingling with the world and we don't have masks and sanitizers going. There are always germs always around us, and some people get sick and some people don't. But is it the immune system and the strength of the host that determines whether or not you get sick? It's really a little bit of both. But some of the things that we can do here are the things that we've been hearing about throughout this pandemic, but also certainly apply to the cold and the flu as well. And did I hear a voice pipe in? Thought I heard a little sound in the background there. So, wash your hands. Just using soap and water will usually work just fine, especially for everyday folks. Staying home when you're sick, giving yourself time to rest, being careful when you're around, especially careful when you're around sick people, masking up, all that good stuff is still applicable here. And then I'd like to note the importance of sleep. And there have been studies that have shown that getting 6 or fewer hours of sleep per night, people were 3 times more likely to catch the common cold. So they had folks with differing amounts of sleep. Everybody got swabbed with the rhinovirus in their nose. And the folks who had gotten less sleep, 6 hours or fewer, were 3 times more likely to actually get sick from that cold versus the folks who had slept 7 hours or more were, less likely to get sick. So that indicates that just something so simple as whether or not you're getting a regular night's sleep on a regular basis could make a pretty big difference in how well your host or your immune system functions in protecting you from infections. It may not be a guarantee, but it can definitely edge things a little bit more in your favor. Some people also just have weaker immune systems. Sometimes that's a more clinical thing. Like I know folks who don't have a spleen and they're much more susceptible. But some folks, like for instance, me, I just seem to have, less like general vitality in some ways than some people do. I always have been. And so if I get run down or if I'm traveling and I'm exposed to germs, I'm more apt to catch them, generally speaking, than somebody with just an innately stronger immune system than my husband would normally catch things. So, some people are just a little bit more susceptible, or they might be a lot more susceptible just based on their immune system function. And there are things that we can do naturally to support that. And it may not, again, guarantee anything, but it does hedge the bets a little bit more in their favor. Low vitamin D levels also seem to be a really big player in the immune system. It gets a lot of press for sure, and is getting a lot of press right now with COVID. And, there's probably a lot more going on than only vitamin D, and it's probably more about whether or not you have adequate levels going into that exposure versus, okay, now you've been exposed, you're starting to get sick, let's pump you full of vitamin D. That might work, but it might be more of just how strong you are going into that exposure. And so you could be taking supplements, may help. There's a lot of debate on all of this. Cod liver oil as a source of vitamin D. Mushrooms can potentially be a source of vitamin D if they've been exposed to sunlight or UV light. And then, of course, having that exposure to sunlight as well. And up here in the North Country, we just don't get enough sun exposure in the wintertime to make adequate amounts of vitamin D for ourselves. So these slides that have the little star on the top are bonus slides. So I'm not really going to focus on them, but you should have a copy of the slides that I gave to your teacher. And so you can check that out if you want to. And things that are underlined, so like right here, I have here is underlined. Once you have your PDF of the slides open, you can click on those and they're hyperlinked so they can open up different web pages or books or various online offerings and studies and things like that that you can check out. So that's a little extra feature of that. So I have a little recipe for DIY sanitizer, which is one of the things that I've been using when I travel about this past year. Now, I didn't used to be into sanitizer, but definitely nowadays I am more so. Feel free to, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to plug them into the chat box and we'll try to address those as we go through and or at the very end. So no matter what's going on and why somebody is getting sick, in all these situations, there is often a place for herbs to bolster the immune system response so that we are better at preventing or reducing the severity of infections and improving the outcome if somebody is, exposed to something. And I do hear, let's see, I think there is somebody with a microphone. Lana, I don't know if you're able to just make sure that other folks are muted. I don't know exactly where that is, but I am hearing a little something in the background for if that's important or not. So
I
nothing is a
got it.
guarantee. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm curious, and this is something you can add into the chat box here just to think about too. Chances are, no matter what your, heritage and where you grew up location wise, herbs played some sort of a role, or foods played some sort of a role in how your family dealt with illness. And, maybe it's something as simple of the particular kind of soup that you would have when you were sick, or some supplements that you might take, or a certain tea. And I'm just curious if you can add, those of you who want to add this to the chat box, what kinds of remedies did you grow up with that, that you enjoyed? So feel free to just kind of plug that in. And I'm going to keep going and talking for now, but I'll come back
Maria,
and look at that. Yes.
are you asking only for colds and flu or any kind
Oh,
of
yes.
remedies?
Specifically, I'm curious about your cold and flu remedies. So what were your family, what were your things that you grew up with that, when you're sick, like for example, in my family, we had these I love them because they tasted like sweet tart candies, but we had these vitamin C chewable tablets. That was back when vitamin C was particularly popular for cold and flu. And so we would chew on those. And, certainly chicken soup was a thing in my family, coming from a Sicilian heritage. Predominantly, we loved our chicken soup. And there might be other remedies too. We didn't do a whole lot of like full-on herbal remedies, but we at least had those things. So I see some things coming in. So let's see, we've got turmeric and neem, turmeric milk, ginger, garlic. And let me just move this so that I can see the whole chat box here. Rose hip chai, that sounds amazing. Pastina with thyme, Italian penicillin. Oh, that's cool. I don't know what pastina is, but thyme sounds good. We've got the turmeric milk with ginger and garlic decoction, ginger tea, turmeric milk, tea, honey, lemon tea. Oh, that was another really big one in our house, was just to have like honey and lemon and black tea or something like that. My husband has a funny story. When he was a kid, he's like, oh, I'll just make this and this will, make me feel better. And he's like, oh, I'll make another cup and I'm going to make another cup. And his mom came home from work and he was like shaking and like how he had so much caffeine because he'd had like 10 cups of black tea as a kid. But usually 1 or 2 cups of a little bit of black tea with lemon and honey is nice. Chicken soup, lots of soup, throat coat tea, elderberry bush. So it's force-fed shoots of elderberry tea. Cool. Salt gargles. So yeah, lots of great things. So yeah, we were big into salt gargles in our households as well. My mom was a nurse, or is a nurse. So we had that perspective. So thanks for all those little additions. So just some basic things that we can do to help support ourselves. So sleep, as I mentioned, and there's the link to one of those studies. There are actually a handful of studies that have shown that, but that's one of them. Basic diet and nutrition, of course, eating a healthy diet is going to be better for us. Our immune system is going to be better able to function if we're eating good, nutritious foods versus, junky food. But specifically, eating more plant foods, getting adequate amounts of vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin C, zinc, selenium, omega-3 fatty acids may play a role here too. Green tea, herbs and spices, mushrooms in the diet. So not shrooms as in hallucinogens, but shrooms as in like me needing to fit it on one line and referring to mushrooms in our diet, or medicinal mushrooms. These are all things that seem to be really helpful. And we're definitely seeing too in some of the early research regarding COVID is that when people are deficient in a lot of these nutrients, it does seem like it's correlated with worser outcomes versus folks who are not deficient in these nutrients. That doesn't necessarily prove, and you guys being more science-based students probably understand this, that doesn't necessarily prove that like taking vitamin D is necessarily going to make you less apt. There may be a lot of other things that influence that. Maybe people who are well nourished are more likely of better privilege and have better access to health care, or they just take better care of their health, or maybe they have more white collar jobs and it's easier for them to not expose themselves to other people in pandemics. So there's probably a lot going on besides just those nutrients, but we do seem to be seeing this trend that people who are more well nourished going into the infectious time period seem to be less likely to get sick and or have reduced severity, reduced duration. So hopefully that will help us out here. And we're talking about COVID right now, but this also potentially applies to the cold and the flu as well. Avoiding a lot of alcohol, consuming a lot of alcohol, smoking, inflammatory activities, all those things are of course important. Washing your hands, wearing masks, sanitizing. And then for remedies, the things that we really tend to turn to most for bolstering the immune system, something to take throughout the winter season or in anticipation kind of long term. Astragalus, which is a medicinal herb from Chinese medicine primarily, and then medicinal mushrooms, which is also something that comes to us from traditional Asian medicine. So having those on a daily basis seem to be helpful for bolstering the immune system so that it's more readily able to fight off those infections if they occur. And then we have our general immune tonics, a lot of the things that are in our spice cabinet and our tea cabinets, a lot of things that we would eat traditionally. So things like bee balm, oregano, thyme, a lot of those mint family, antimicrobial aromatic herbs, garlic. Fermented foods may be supportive here for the immune system, ginger, green tea, spices, all that good stuff. And then turning to things like echinacea or elderberry, you can use them preventatively. There are some studies that support that use, but they're more about something that you would really pump up in the system when you know that you're more susceptible, or if you've been exposed, or if you're at that very early sign. That's usually when we'll tend to turn more to the echinacea or elderberry. And we're going to go to a lot of these herbs in more detail in just a moment. So bonus slide, various immune foods. And so getting into some of our deep immune tonics, so things that you might take if somebody had a weaker immune system, to take on a daily basis for prevention, and or with post-infection convalescence, when people are, technically over the illness, but they're just still feeling kind of cruddy and they're not quite up to snuff. These are herbs that we might consider throwing in. So we've got like the mushrooms and possibly also astragalus, but also we have a lot of other things as well, like our adaptogenic herbs. So mushrooms. I love mushrooms because they have so much value, and we could be using overt medicinal mushrooms like reishi, but we could also be using edible, common edible food mushrooms like shiitake or button mushrooms or oyster mushrooms, and they all have benefit as long as they're safe to consume. If it's a toxic mushroom, then we don't want to be using it. But safe medicinal and edible mushrooms to include regularly into the diet or into your supplement routine are likely to have a lot of benefits. And remember when I said earlier, it's always important to listen to your body. So if you're somebody that mushrooms don't agree with, then mushrooms aren't your answer. You can find something else instead. But for most of us, mushrooms can be really helpful. So mushrooms have some complex starches called polysaccharides, and some specific polysaccharides would include glucans and beta glucans, but there are quite a few different kinds that are there. And they seem to do a nice job challenging the immune system. So I like to think of it as sending your immune system back to boot camp. And they seem to improve the signaling of the immune system, the functioning of the immune system, your white blood cell counts, your other, various immune cell counts, so that they're just more optimal. It's not so much that they're stimulating the immune system, it's more that they're modulating the immune system, that they're putting it where it really should ideally be. And that's really helpful because usually for most cases, if somebody has autoimmune disease or allergy, if you just stimulated the immune system, that might actually put the immune system into overdrive and be problematic. But for the most part, as far as my training goes, and you'll hear differing viewpoints on this, but from my training, my experience, and the studies that I've seen, having mushrooms on a regular basis is often helpful, whether somebody has more of a weaker immune system or they need a little bit of a boost as they go into the infection season, or if they have autoimmune disease or if they have allergies, it seems to be helpful there too. And also a lot of the research around medicinal mushrooms revolves around cancer and supporting the immune system there as well, not as a solo treatment or anything like that, but as a really useful adjunct. In Asia, there are a couple different medications that are derived from mushrooms that are used alongside the more traditional like chemotherapy agents to improve outcomes in cancer and reduce relapse and all that other stuff. But that's not really the focus of our talk today. So we'll focus on the immune system stuff. So these are best to have daily. So it's not like, oh, I'm coming down with something, let me have, a serving of shiitake mushrooms. It's more like, let's just on a regular basis with our daily diet or our daily supplement routine to be taking some of these mushrooms into our system and sending it back to boot camp. So I have little like ways to remember. So mushrooms, boot camp, get everything kind of functioning better in the immune system. And they can contain vitamin D. That's sort of a separate cool thing about them if they're exposed to sunlight. And specifically, it's kind of like with our own skin. So if you have an area of your skin that doesn't normally see the sun and you expose that to the sunlight, especially if you're a paler skin person, you might notice that you get a worse sunburn in those areas and you're making more vitamin D in those areas. Same thing is true for mushrooms. So if you take a mushroom and you flip it upside down where the sun doesn't normally shine, they'll make even more vitamin D that way than they would if you had them right side up in the sun or in UV light. And in one of the little tests that was done, we had 3 ounces of shiitake mushrooms and they were exposed for 6 hours. And the vitamin D content went from just 110 IU to 46,000 IU of vitamin D in those 3 ounces of shiitake mushrooms. So if you were going to be using your mushrooms as a source of vitamin D and they have to be exposed to the sun or UV light in order to get that vitamin D benefit. You get the other benefits, but not the vitamin D benefit. You might only take those vitamin D ones in smaller quantities so you don't OD on vitamin D. And it is the vitamin D2 form versus vitamin D3, which is not as nice for the body as D3, but it does still seem to have some benefits. And it's important when you're talking about making medicine or food from mushrooms that the best way to get them in your system is to have cooked them first. Especially they really like hot water, but if you've got a tender edible, you can also just cook that and eat it, throw it into a saute or something like that. But we don't usually just take powdered up dried mushrooms and consume them. They contain chitin that's going to make it very hard to access all of the various benefits of the mushrooms. And by doing that hot water, simmering, slow decoction, decoct is when we simmer things, that will help break down the chitin, that tough fiber that we also find in shellfish. And that way we can access the beta glucans and the other benefits. Alcohol doesn't, and the polysaccharides really do not get along very well. So you're not likely to get as much benefit from like a tincture of mushrooms. There's some perks, but really when it comes to the polysaccharides, that's not the best way to go. Those hot water extractions or having them in your food is going to be better. And it's even better if you powder it and then you cook it or simmer it. You'll get even more of the benefits that way. You can take some supplements, and there are a lot of different formats that are on the market. Some are extracted and then they put them into pills. So that way you can just swallow them and use them that way. Other ones are, they use the mycelium. So they grow the mushroom on some sort of grain or other substrate. And then they take that mycelium, so it's not get the fruiting body of the mushroom, and put that in the pill. And that seems to have some benefits. It's not the traditional way of using it, but it does seem to have some benefits, and it doesn't seem to need to be heated up quite the same way as a fruiting body does. Also, if you have a mushroom fruiting body and you have it raw, if it's an otherwise safe mushroom, sometimes they're still a little bit toxic when they're raw, but safe when you cook it. But I want to be clear that if it's a overtly like toxic mushroom, even if you cook it, it's still going to be toxic. So this is just referring to your otherwise, safe, edible, medicinal mushrooms. They might be a little bit toxic if you have them raw, but once you cook them, they're safe and more bioavailable. But if you have a toxic mushroom, like a deadly Amanita mushroom, it doesn't matter if you cook it, it can still kill you. So I want to be clear, because I think last time I taught this class, that didn't come across, and I had some people saying, oh, that's cool, I didn't know you could cook mushrooms and then they were safe. I'm like, no, just the safe ones are safe that way, not the dangerous ones. If somebody doesn't tolerate mushrooms, then astragalus would be a good alternative that you could turn to instead. So some of my favorites, there are so many different kinds of mushrooms out there, and you can pretty much use them all. They all have their own individual special powers, but you can use them all as a general immune support. But my favorites, shiitake is one of my absolute favorites, and that's what's shown in this picture up here. Very classic mushroom. It's one of the most cultivated and sold mushrooms on the market, so it's pretty easy to find. It's not too expensive, and I like it because it's pretty mild tasting. So I like to buy it raw and dried, and then I powder it up and add it to my soup broths. I'll add it to casseroles. I might cook it, saute it with other things and make my morning breakfast eggs in it. And I don't personally really love the taste of mushrooms that much, but I like that shiitake is kind of mild. And so that's one of my favorites. So especially in broth, when I make my chicken broth, I'll usually throw a good, half cup or so of ground up shiitake dried mushrooms into that broth. Maitake is really good, especially if it's fresh. It's really quite delicious. There are even some good recipes out there that you can simmer it in seasonings and make like a beef jerky with maitake mushrooms, which would be kind of fun. Reishi mushroom is my favorite from a medicinal standpoint. I think I have a bigger slide on reishi coming up. Turkey tails is really classic, and that's what this one down here is, turkey tails, and that one has more research, especially on the cancer benefits and on the immune support and immunomodulatory benefits. Lion's mane, which I have a lot of things on my screen, so let's see, where is it? I think the lion's mane might be kind of like not shown. I think it's underneath here, but that one's a really nice one for nerve health and brain tonic. It has all the other benefits too, but has some special benefits for regenerating nerves and helping nerves heal after damage, which is kind of cool. And a lot of people do like chaga, that's shown down here. I'm not using chaga quite so much these days because of sustainability reasons. But you can use any ones, button mushrooms still have benefits, and oyster mushrooms and your classic edibles are all good too. So I love reishi. This is a really classic mushroom in various systems of Asian medicine, including Chinese medicine. And I'm a Western herbalist. I'm not really trained in Chinese medicine, but I still, have adopted a few remedies into my repertoire. And this is one that I rely on quite a bit. I personally take it every day for various reasons, including immune support. And I even named my dog after it because I just I just like the mushroom so much. So her name is Reishi. And so Ganoderma lucidum, as well as other Ganoderma species, seem to be somewhat interchangeable. And not only do they have all those immunomodulatory and immune supportive properties that we just talked about, but they also have, reishi mushrooms have additional benefits. So they do have some ability to act as an adaptogen. And if you're not familiar with adaptogens, adaptogens are herbs that help your body adapt to stress. And they seem to help by modulating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, among other things. But, really they're nice for helping so that if we're faced with stress, we're less likely to just go straight into that fight or flight mode. And we still have some nice calm energy. And I love reishi because it's just sort of gentle in that respect. It's not it's not ginseng like, it's not quite as stimulating as some of the other ones, but it's just a good sort of like bolstering, supportive effect there. It also has a little bit of some calming properties. It's really supportive for the cardiovascular system, the liver, the nervous system. It's a great daily tonic. It's specifically a little bit more on the anti-allergy effect versus other mushrooms. It has some terpenes and other constituents besides the polysaccharides that help reduce inflammation and reduce allergic response. There have even been a few cool studies, and they were multi-herb formulas from Chinese medicine, but reishi was one of the main ingredients. And they found that having that on a regular basis reduced people's likelihood to have anaphylactic peanut allergy responses. So I do oftentimes have my clients take reishi mushroom as part of their daily repertoire for various reasons. And oftentimes they will find that as time goes on, that their seasonal allergies are less. I wouldn't necessarily try out the anaphylactic peanut one at home because that could be really dangerous if it doesn't work. But, if people had a lot of food sensitivities, they might find that after, 6 months to a year of taking reishi mushroom, that those things are not quite as dramatic, that the immune system is functioning just a little bit better. Those are complicated issues, and that's not always as simple as that, but it is neat that reishi lends a hand there. It has a lot of really nice lung and respiratory tonic benefits beyond just your typical mushroom benefits. And that's another reason why I really like reishi when we're talking about cold and flu and other common respiratory ailments. And this is with long-term use, like months, a year, maybe even, more than that. But it's something I might have clients who traditionally get pneumonia every year. I might have them take a mushroom formula that really emphasizes reishi on a regular basis. And they may find that they don't get pneumonia that next year because of the reishi mushroom supporting their respiratory system. Also seems to help with oxygen utilization. But again, these are long-term benefits. This is with taking it daily for months, if not even a year or longer. So that seems to be where it's best. It is a bit bitter. That's kind of one of the two downsides to reishi is, one, it's a little bitter. So it's not as easy to have in some of our recipes in large quantities. And then two, it's really tough. It's like a piece of wood. I've got one over on the shelf over there. And if I was to knock it on the counter, it would be like knocking it with a chunk of wood or something. So it's not something that you're going to just sit and eat, but you can simmer it into broths. You can take it as a supplement. You you can also make some coffee-like substitutes with it, and that aren't too bad. So it can be interesting in a chai tea or a coffee substitute tea and work pretty well there.
Maria, can I ask you a question about reishi?
Yeah.
So I've had experience making reishi into a broth, and it just came out so bitter that my family said no way. Do you have any tips or tricks on how to incorporate reishi so it's not overpoweringly bitter, or is it just better to go with the bitterness and say, okay, I'm drinking it like coffee, for example?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I very rarely throw it into my broths in any significant quantity. I'm more apt to turn to something pleasant tasting like shiitake, and that's what I put in my broth. If I do put reishi in the broth, it's like one or two like thin strips in the whole, gallon pot of it, which at that point in time, we're not getting a very high dose of reishi. So if you do end up making a broth like you did and it was just not very palatable, what I have done that before, it's still great medicine. I might just take small quantities of that broth and mix it in with very strongly flavored recipes, like put just a little bit of it in a big pot of chili or a jambalaya or something like that, so that you can kind of cover up the flavor and just use it up in that way. But I'm more apt to use that one as a dietary supplement, as a pill, as a tincture. Even though I'm not going to get the polysaccharides so much from a tincture, I do get some of those other terpenes and other constituents that lend Rishi's other various benefits. So I do take it that way, and I recommend it that way. And I do like it in some of the concentrated syrups and coffee-like substitutes. So I think it's kind of a little bit more palatable in that way, where you're already expecting a bit more of a bitter flavor, and you can add a little bit of sweetener like blackstrap molasses to it that'll complement that flavor quite nicely.
Great,
But I'll be
thank you.
honest, yeah, I don't personally throw this one in my broth so much. You can, but it can be a little bit too bitter. And some batch to batch, you might get some reishi mushrooms are more or less bitter than others too. The more bitter they are, the more medicinal they usually are, but that can be a little unpalatable. So
Thanks.
shiitake I mentioned, and let's see, let me just move my chat box so I can see. So I was curious if you guys have a favorite mushroom or way to consume your mushrooms. So if you do, go ahead and put that in the chat box. But I talked a little bit about shiitake already, and lion's mane, I just have a slide here. That's the one that seems to be more specific for the nerves and nerve regeneration and nerve healing and the brain, in addition to our other typical mushroom uses. And it tastes pretty good. So lots of benefits there. Cordyceps has a certain affinity for oxygen and the lungs. It's a little bit more stimulating. I'm not going to really go into it, but I have a slide there. Turkey tails is the one that we tend to use more in cancer protocols. And then astragalus is and actually, let's see, what kind of recipes do we have here? So I make onions, garlic, and mushrooms, and then mix it with my grains like buckwheat or freekeh. Awesome. And mushroom added to miso soup. Yes, that's excellent. Grilled mushrooms, that's another great way to use them, especially like a nice portobello, like a meaty portobello would be good there. Awesome. Great recipes. So yeah, so these are all things that you could just, a couple times a week or every day, just include some mushrooms in your diet, or, you could find a supplement and take them as supplements as well. So if you don't do well with mushrooms, like there are some people who are just allergic to mushrooms or they hate mushrooms, you could try astragalus instead. And this also comes from traditional Chinese and other Asian forms of medicine. And it's the root slices that we're using of a legume. And it has somewhat similar properties. It's very rich in polysaccharides and has a nice immunomodulatory benefit. So we tend to think of mushrooms and astragalus to have on a regular basis, months leading up and throughout if you were looking for something to take throughout cold and flu season, these would be your things that you could consider taking. And also, this is a good herb to consider in convalescence. So if somebody is more or less done with their illness, but they're still not 100%, you might want to do a little bit of astragalus at that time. Or if you have somebody who just generally has a weaker immune system, that might be part of their repertoire. And from my understanding, my limited understanding of traditional Chinese medicine, normally we would not be using astragalus in an acute infection. So it's not that it's necessarily harmful, but it's just not considered as energetically appropriate in those states. So when somebody was actually coming down with something, we'd usually get rid of the astragalus for that period of time and enter in some of the next remedies that we'll talk about. There's a little less of that issue with the mushrooms, but it's kind of specific to astragalus. let's see, I think those are some, and it tastes pretty good. It's kind of sweet and woody. So it's much more palatable, and you could throw it into those soups or stews. And tea makes really great tea blends, like with ginger and other things. You can take it as a supplement, as a tincture, capsule, any of those things. You can use astragalus as. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about it, probably, but those are some of the big things. Sometimes you'll hear of astragalus being referred to as an adaptogen. It's not really an adaptogen for the stress side of the body so much, but it does have that modulatory effect and that tonic effect for the immune system in somewhat similar way that we talk about adaptogens as having for the nervous system. There are other adaptogens that are more classic adaptogens. So these are those herbs that help support the stress response and help the body adapt to stress and modulate the stress response. But a lot of them also have benefits for the immune system too. So you might incorporate them into your repertoire, or they can also be potentially useful after somebody's been infected with an infection to just help support them if things are still lingering and their energy and vitality isn't quite there. So things like ashwagandha, holy basil, Codonopsis, schizandra, rhodiola, and eleuthero are all options. And each herb has their own individual uses. So, I'm just mentioning them here, but if you wanted to use them, you'd want to dig into each one a little bit more individually. But they do blend quite nicely with mushrooms and or astragalus in formulas as well, or you could just turn to them as they are. So now let's say somebody's starting to get sick, and I should do a little time check here. I think we're actually doing pretty well on time. And so if somebody is exposed or susceptible, then we have a lot of other options that we might bring to the table as well. So these things might help reduce the severity and the intensity and the duration, but again, nothing is guaranteed. And usually when somebody's coming down with something, you want to pump them with a lot of these remedies and just kind of keep it up every hour, every 2 hours, every 3 hours, however often you can, getting that into their system. So of course, first and foremost is resting and sleeping. And we often undervalue that. And this is something I often will warn my students, even before we were in the midst of a pandemic, of if you're sick, a lot of times people don't like taking that time off to rest, but it is really important. You'll get over the infection faster if you rest while your body is fighting it. So your body can use all the energy it has to fight off the infection. And also don't bounce back too quickly. Usually we don't like having to stop our life for a while to be sick. And so as soon as you feel a little better, people are often wanting to like jump back into things. And even with the herbs, this can be a trick with the herbs, because sometimes you feel better because the herbs, you're like, oh, good, I'll just take my elderberry syrup and then I can go to work and do this and do that errand and run around the house or whatever it is I need to do. But you should still keep resting and giving yourself plenty of TLC. And when we bounce back too quickly, that's often when we see infections getting worse, rebound infections, a cold turning into pneumonia, all of those kinds of things. And I don't know for sure whether or not this pattern happens with COVID, but I'm going to guess that it probably does. And in some of the case reports that I have heard about COVID, especially in those early stages, sometimes it kind of comes and goes for a few days where people feel kind of cruddy or very cruddy, and then they start to feel a little bit better. And if you just kind of jump back and like, ooh, I'm going to do all these things that I haven't been able to do, and then it comes back the next day and then you feel like even worse. So give yourself plenty of time to heal, no matter what kind of an infection it is, and plenty of time to rest. Lots of fluids, so having water, broth, tea, especially hot fluids are great. Miso, usually your body craves what your body needs, so it'll feel good for you, whatever it is that you need. The general immune tonics from our diets, there are a lot of great foods. So having the broth and the soups, green tea can, as long as the caffeine doesn't bother you. There are some various studies that have shown immune system support benefits for green tea. Mushrooms, as we mentioned already, pungent herbs, so things like garlic, onions, cayenne, ginger, all that good stuff. Bee balm, rosemary, oregano. It was interesting that when the pandemic first kind of took off last year, that a lot of times people were quarantined at home and having these symptoms that, probably were COVID. Sometimes they were diagnosed. Oftentimes they weren't, because I couldn't get to testing, and they didn't have much to choose from for remedies. And I heard a lot from various folks that, while it wasn't like it cured them, having things like rosemary and ginger and teas and broths and steams, that those things really did help them make them feel a lot better. And that was something that they already had in their kitchen. So I think it's great to remember all these things that are pretty readily available, oftentimes in our kitchen or the grocery store. I would skip the astragalus in that, early onset of an infection and turn to all the other remedies. Elderberry, we're going to talk about in a little bit, but elderberry is a remedy that considers starting to take as soon as you feel susceptible or exposed, or you're starting to notice that tingling sensation of something coming on. Elderberry is oftentimes really helpful in that stage in particular. And ginger tea, echinacea, again, might be really helpful, especially in those early stages, and other remedies like fire cider and garlic. And I don't tend to work with andrographis, which comes from India, and umca, which comes from Africa, but those are also really great respiratory infection considerations. And there's quite a bit of really nice research on them. Andrographis is really bitter, so that's something to keep in mind. It's like super, if you thought reishi was bitter, andrographis is super bitter, but it is a pretty amazing and revered herb, especially from India and other parts of the world that are in that general region. And then umca, umca labo-wabo, I think is the full term, but it's a type of geranium that grows in South Africa, and that has some pretty nice benefits for the respiratory system and infections as well. So I'm curious for you, if you notice any patterns. For me personally, if I am not getting enough sleep or I'm doing too much when it comes to just the typical cold or flu, that's usually when I'm going to get sick, usually right around December or so, when I'm teaching 10 classes over 2 week span of time, and I'm talking a lot and I'm not sleeping as well, and I'm stressed out, or I'm traveling and I'm not sleeping as well. That's usually when I'm going to come down with something, because I'm more susceptible during those times. So I'm curious if you have noticed any patterns in which you're most likely to catch an infection, beyond just that you're exposed to it, but when you notice that you're more susceptible. So we have, yeah, I can see that one around exams or right before the semester starts, because we're stressed, and the stress is going to weaken our immune system a little bit. But then also, because we're stressed, we might not be taking as good care of ourselves, and we probably aren't going to be sleeping as well. Even if we want to sleep, sometimes we can't sleep. And then that, makes us a little bit more susceptible. So seasonal changes, that's another really big one. So, as the seasons are shifting, we tend to be a little bit more vulnerable as the energetics of the seasons change. And that's pretty common time for a lot of folks to get sick as we go into fall or winter, or even just like this time of year that we're in right now, where we're going from winter into spring, and the weather is, warm, cold, damp, dry, and shifting around quite a bit. Our body gets a little bit more out of equilibrium, is a little bit more sensitive. Midterms, finals week, stress during the spring when my allergies are bad. Yeah, that is definitely another big one, when our allergy responses are worse, and we're being hit by so much more of whatever your common allergen is, that tends to really tick off the immune system and can make us more susceptible in other ways as well. Late April, early May on the dot. And yeah, my mom has a tendency towards pneumonia, and she probably did have COVID around this time of year last year, but that's also her typical time of year that she would get pneumonia, is just at this season. Her respiratory system is one of her weakest areas, and she loves to sing. She sings with the choir, and it's Easter and all the Holy Week stuff. And so she's straining her respiratory system. And at the same time, she, is under a lot of stress during that time period. And so for her, that's one of her common patterns. And if she takes her remedies leading up to it, some years she's able to avoid that. And then other years, not so much. I find that I get a summer sinus infection if I don't take my allergy medications. So yeah, that can be really common too. So yeah, lots of patterns. It's good to be aware of your patterns. Another one that comes up sometimes is, especially folks, for women as well as folks who have ovaries, that in that cycle time, like that premenstrual time, that sometimes we're just a little bit more sensitive. And there could be a little bit of a drop of both estrogen and progesterone before menses, and both estrogen and progesterone support the immune system a little bit. So if you end up with a little bit too much of a dip, especially if you're really stressed and you kind of there can be a little bit of a dip of that progesterone earlier than normal. So you end up with a few days right before your period where you're low on both estrogen and progesterone and the immune supportive benefits that they offer. And so that's another time that you'll often see folks become more apt to catch something. It's right during that time. So just some common sense suggestions. So if somebody thinks that they may have COVID, certainly call your doctor, get tested if you suspect that you have it, self-quarantine, all that good stuff that we've been hearing about. I would recommend doing any of those things. Sometimes I see people in the holistic world get a little bit cavalier when it comes to knowing that we have all these natural remedies that are probably helpful. And they'll be like, oh, well, I don't need to do all these other things because I'm just going to take my elderberry syrup. And it's actually better to do all these things together, including all the traditional things that we're being told to do through conventional medicine too. So also keep in mind that COVID can escalate very rapidly and dangerously. So somebody might be just kind of lingering with kind of like meh issues, or maybe it's kind of going up and down, but nothing too crazy. And then there can be this moment where it just suddenly escalates quite heavily and may require medical care acutely. So just be aware of that, especially, these things can happen with the cold and flu too, but it's a much bigger concern with COVID. And if you are experiencing difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, if you're turning blue, if you're listless, have intense fatigue, dizzy, confusion, if you're fainting or you're hard to wake up, chest or upper abdominal pain, bleeding, sudden or severe pain, vomiting, or excessive amounts of diarrhea. These are all times to seek emergency medical attention and not necessarily times to go brew yourself a cup of tea. So echinacea is one of the most famous herbs for the immune system, especially here in the West. It was really popularized. It comes traditionally from, it's a Native American plant, and but Germany got a hold of it and did a lot of research on it as well. And so a lot of the research on echinacea came out of Germany and Europe, but it is typically traditionally more of a Native American plant. And it seems to act predominantly as an immune system mobilizer. So if we're thinking of our little watchwords for each of our key immune herbs, this is one that's going to like send the troops out and put guns in their hands and be like, all right, folks, it's ready to go and fight this infection. There is also a little bit of a cleanup crew action. Echinacea really does a lot of different things for the immune system. So another thing that it does is it helps work throughout the lymphatic system to clear the battle debris. Because whenever we're fighting a battle, there are a lot of dead bodies floating around in our blood system and our lymphatic system. Sorry, not our blood, but our lymphatic system. And echinacea does do a nice job helping to kind of mop that up and clean things up as well. And it also is a hyaluronidase inhibitor. So it can, on contact, help prevent infections like viruses and bacteria from breaking into cells quite so efficiently by inhibiting the enzyme hyaluronidase. And it is a little bit of an antimicrobial in and of itself. And it does have some polysaccharides. So it is a little bit of an immune system modulator from the polysaccharide perspective, but there's so much more to it that I don't tend to think of it that way. I tend to think of it more as a mobilizer, increasing white blood cells. And oftentimes that's helpful in those early stages of infection, or when you think you've been exposed is a good time to really like pump up that echinacea. The earlier you catch an infection with your herbs, the easier it's going to be to have an impact on it, versus if you wait until you already feel like absolute crud and things are full blown, it's going to be harder for the herbs to have as much of an impressive impact on them at that time. The Echinacea angustifolia root is probably the most effective, and that's this very like sort of dainty looking echinacea here, and angustifolia means narrow leafed, so you see that it has narrow leaves, versus the purpurea, which is what is mostly used in some of the European phytopharmacology, because that's what they got. They meant to get Echinacea angustifolia, and by the time Vogel realized that they had actually sent him purpurea and that's what he was growing, they were like, we'll stick with it. And so this is what we often see cultivated, because it's much easier to cultivate the purpurea. They both have benefits, and there are a lot of other species of echinacea that have somewhat similar properties as well. And we can use all parts of the plants as well, the flowers, the seeds, the leaves, the roots, but the roots tend to be the strongest, especially the Echinacea angustifolia root. The problem is that it's very hard to cultivate the angustifolia, and there are concerns with overharvesting it from the wild. So, most often we are using the purpurea. And there's certainly a run on the market. That's been one of the issues with the pandemic, is that as we all go to stock up on these things because we're sick, or we just want to, stock up our medicine cabinet so that we're well prepared, that we have seen such a huge interest in herbal medicine that there are a lot more out of stocks. And just be aware that in this means that companies are either going to be out of stock on some of our key things, or they may be getting sources in from less quality or less well-established relationships with growers and harvesters. So we're probably going to be seeing a little bit of an impact on the market in a variety of negative ways because of all of the extra interest. And that will certainly and is certainly affecting echinacea, among other things. So something to keep in mind, to be cautious about with echinacea, there are a variety of things to keep in mind with echinacea. One of them is that it is in the daisy family. So for people who have daisy family flower allergies, sometimes they might react there. Also, because it is more of an immune stimulant, in my mind at least, versus some of these other things that we're talking about, we're a little bit more apt to see issues with autoimmune disease and allergies, that it may exacerbate them because it's aggravating a wayward immune system response. That's not necessarily true for everybody. There are actually times where echinacea has helped with allergies and has helped folks with autoimmune disease, but there are some people that get flare-ups with it. So it's just something to keep in mind. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it, but I would be cautious using it for the first time if you're one of those people in those camps, and start with a low dose. It's actually always a good idea if you're new to something to start with just a little bit and then work your dose up. If it was for like a daily tonic thing, you could work it up over the course of a week or a couple weeks. In the case of an infection, you kind of want to take it like right then and there. So you might just have a little bit, and then like an hour or two later, have a little bit more, and then escalate your dose within a shorter period of time. Some other things about echinacea, it's a little bit more apt to have some potential herb drug interactions around clearing drugs from the system. It's a little bit debated how intense or not intense that response might be, but that's something to be aware of as well. And if somebody was on, with any of these herbs, if somebody was on immune suppressive or any other drugs that are affecting the immune system, you'd want to do some deeper digging as to whether or not it's okay and safe to use these alongside. I do prefer with echinacea fresh plant tincture, fresh plant alcohol extract, and I find that to be one of the more useful ways of using it. It does not taste good, and it makes you salivate, and it makes your tongue numb and kind of weird. So it's not my favorite one to take. And there are some companies that make like liquid phytocaps, and that's my second best favorite way of taking it. And it can be quite nice for that. It's traditionally used more as an antibacterial in traditional herbal history, but we've started to use it more often for viral infections as well. So I've got a slide in here on how to make a tincture, and another slide on just some different throat combinations, throat spray combinations that you could try making. And echinacea is a pretty good one to consider for throat sprays because it's numbing, and it also has some benefits on contact as well as some systemic effects as well. And usually we combine it with other antimicrobials and some soothing remedies and something to kind of soften that alcohol. Because if you just spray straight up alcohol in the back of your throat, it's going to actually irritate and burn your throat. So we'll soften it usually with some glycerin or some honey to make it taste good, but also make it so that it's not physically irritating the tissue as much as otherwise. And when you're taking those tinctures, you want to dilute them in a little bit of water to take them. You don't usually take them straight up. So elderberry, this is another really awesome herb, and one that I personally love and use a lot of. There has been a lot of controversy around elderberry this past year, and I'll talk about that a little bit since I think we have plenty of time. We're actually doing well on time. And I have a whole big blog post that you can see here on elderberry. So you can check that out. It goes into a lot of the studies that have been done on elderberry. I put that blog together last year when some of the controversy around it first erupted and people were asking me what I thought about it. So I dug into the literature and then wrote it on a blog, what I thought about it, and posted everything out so that it was easy to follow. But elderberry, Sambucus nigra, there are a lot of different subspecies. So Sambucus nigra comes predominantly from Europe, but there are a lot of other blue black elderberry species, and they've recently all been lumped into the black elderberry group, but now they're just subspecies. But we have elderberry species that grow all over the world and subspecies that grow all over the world. So the canadensis is the one that traditionally grows in the wild around here where I live in the northeast of the United States. There are some other ones that's got like cerulata or something like that. I can never quite remember. But on the West Coast, we have a blue elderberry that is now considered a subspecies of the Nigra. There are some elderberry species that grow in Asia. And so they have a pretty long history of use and are pretty widespread. And we're predominantly going to be using the berries. There are other species that are red berries. So like we have the Sambucus racemosa is the one that is the red elder here in New England, and it grows wild, especially up north. That one is not traditionally used by most people because it's a little bit more toxic and nauseating. Sambucus nigra is pretty safe. All the various blue-black elderberries are generally pretty safe as long as they're properly ripe. And the berries that you're just using the berries and not using like the leaves and the stems and the roots. Those are more concerning, more toxic, more nauseating. And if they're dry, they're going to be safer. And if they're cooked, they're also pretty safe. So you could use it cooked, fresh and then cook it, or you can use it dry and then make a recipe, especially if you then use that to say make tea. And I personally like to use the dried elderberries to make syrups and then also to make to make teas. That's what I most often will use. We can also use the flowers of the same black elder species, the blue and black elder species. And, if a few little tiny flower stems get in there, it's okay. But mainly we're just using those individual little flowers. Fresh, possibly, but more often dried. And you can make extracts like tinctures with them. You can have them in tea, and they have slightly different properties. So for the berries, I think of those as a force field, and elderberry gets a lot of press. And I think some of that is really well deserved because I do think it's a pretty amazing, cool plant. It's pretty safe and it's pretty well tolerated usually. And it tastes good too. And it's widespread. It's something you can cultivate. It's something that's found wild. So I think all those things make it really accessible and approachable. And I'm curious too, if, you can throw this in the chat box, if you've ever used elderberry before for the immune system and if it worked for you or not. So feel free to plug that into the chat box. But
Maria, I'm going to tell you that everyone who's enrolled in this class, and we do have a few guests today, but anyone who is enrolled was supposed to purchase some elderberry. So everyone have tasted elderberry at some point during the last few weeks. And also I shared your advice for ginger, elderberry, lemon balm, and hibiscus tea. I know that most of the students did not have access to hibiscus, but most had other plants on hand. So I am suspecting that some of them might have made the preparation as you have recommended it. So
awesome. Cool. And I was hoping to, and I didn't get a chance to throw one together. I couldn't prepare it in advance since I'm not the one hosting this class. But I was hoping to kind of throw together a quick little poll and see what ingredients folks used in their teas. And since unless Lana, you have the ability to throw together a quick poll, we can maybe just have people plug it into the chat box. So I'm curious if you have tried the elderberry or what other things you may have thrown into your tea and what you thought about it, if you liked it. And you can play around with that. I love combining it with hibiscus just because the hibiscus makes it a pretty color and a little bit more fruity flavor. But elderberry is the key medicine here. So feel free to plug these things into the chat box if you've used it, how it worked, what your tea ingredients were that you personally made, and you can just kind of plug that into the chat box as we're going, and I will come back to that. So when I think of elderberry's medicine when it comes to the immune system, the main way to think about it is it's a force field. So when we have elderberry, especially in relatively large doses, and especially at that very early onset, or if you're exposed or more susceptible, what it seems to do is it goes in and it prevents the viruses from latching onto and breaking into cells. Because as you probably already know, one of the ways in which viruses work is they'll break into your cell and then they reprogram your cell to make more viruses. And then these new viruses kind of explode out. And that's where some of that cell damage is partly what makes you feel cruddy, but that's also how that virus has a chance to really replicate and get out of control in the body. And so elderberry, one of the key ways in which it works is by helping to bind to some of those ways in which the virus would typically bind to the cell and inhibit it so it can't break into the cell so easily. So you can see why it's particularly useful, Not so much. I mean, you can have it as a daily preventative, but it's not really bolstering the immune system in the same way that as the astragalus or the mushrooms would be. And if you were already like full blown infection, taking elderberry might not really matter because by this point in time, your body's just loaded with viral compounds anyway. But it's really best at that earlier onset or when you know you're going to be susceptible. Like I will often take a bottle of it with me when I travel, back in the days when I did more travel. And I would just say, look like a closet alcoholic because I'd have my little, like I'd go through the airport security and have it in my liquid bag. And then I throw it in my purse once I got through. And I just take a little quick sip of my elderberry bottle every hour or so as I'd be traveling, whenever I'd think of it while traveling. And I'd have a couple bottles in my checked baggage as well, and just work my way through it and use that as a way to help prevent me from getting infections when I travel. Because I work from home, even in normal times, I find that when I do go out and expose myself to lots of the world's germs, my body's just not used to that. And having elderberry in advance can be really helpful for those kinds of situations where you're going to be exposed or more susceptible, or at that very early tickle. And a good elderberry syrup, I find, and this is the recipe that I'll show you, I find to work really nicely. A good elderberry syrup, often you'll feel it working. You'll notice that like maybe within 30 minutes to an hour after you take it, that you're like, oh, I do feel better. And then if you don't take it, usually within 2 to 4 hours, you might notice those symptoms starting to creep back in. So there probably are some direct anti-inflammatory actions too, especially with those deep blue purple pigments that are in there. And there may be other benefits as well, but those are some of the main ways I see the elderberry working and really the best time to take it. The flower has its own sets of benefits, and often I do incorporate the flower into the syrup that I personally make for myself. And that the flowers are a bit of a diaphoretic, so they're going to help you break a sweat, help the fever response be more effective, which is nice because if you just take something to inhibit, to bring down a fever sort of symptomatically, you feel better, but it doesn't allow the fever to do its job in the response to helping to fight an infection. Whereas something like ginger or elderflower, which are herbal diaphoretics, they seem to help speed up that process of the fever so that you break the sweat and the fever has a better chance to do what it needs to do, but you're not having to linger in this feverish state for quite so long. So elderberry is pretty classic there, elderflower rather. And the flower is also a little bit of an antihistamine, so it's often used for allergies. Both of these are very kid friendly, and may also help as an antihistamine for your typical respiratory infection symptoms as well. But keep in mind that the raw does contain some cyanide-like compounds, which could be a bit nauseating. And the seeds are also a little nauseating too. So personally, I like a whole dried berry that you can strain out. I don't personally like to eat the whole things. I don't use powders of the berries because you wouldn't be able to strain out the seeds. And some people are more susceptible to that nauseating effect. If you dry it and or cook it, that should get rid of some of the toxic potential as well as some of that nauseating potential that's in elder, but that will help. But some people are also still just more sensitive. I find some of the commercial products on the market make me like violently nauseous, but the recipe that I'm going to share with you in the next slide, agrees with me just fine. I don't personally get nauseous from it at all. And I actually noticed that it seems to work better too. So let's see. We should go back to that cytokine storm thing in a moment, but I see we have some comments. So I've used ginger, homegrown lemons, ooh, homegrown, lucky you, and the elderberry syrup we made in class last month and infused it with lemon balm. That's a great one too. I actually don't normally talk about lemon balm when I talk about the immune system, but I did slide it into today's slideshow. So we will be getting to that. Somebody else says, I tried the tea using some guidance from the Body into Balance book. I added milky oats from my regular nettle tea to help with the grassier taste, and then added my homemade rosehip syrup for sweetener. That sounds really quite yummy too. Lovely. Lozenges made with elderberry are also really popular. I mostly use it as a syrup or tea. Elderberry, because of those blue purple pigments, which is one of the constituents that has some benefit, are those blue purple pigments. It's not just that, it also is some of those same cyanide-like compounds that make it potentially toxic in very small doses as part of where it gets the antiviral effect from. But those blue purple pigments, they're tannin rich and they love to bind to stuff. So as time goes on, I find that extracts like a tincture get kind of raisiny, and a lot of the benefits subside with time. So sugar, syrups, honey, glycerin, all those things help stabilize those pigments for a little bit longer. But also, this is the kind of thing that I usually only want to keep as an extract on my shelf, like a syrup on my shelf for maybe 6 months to a year. It's not like some tinctures that I would keep on hand for 10 years. Those pigments are just going to eventually precipitate out, bind to tannins and precipitate out, or bind those tannins in the pigments will bind to other constituents and precipitate out. And it's very similar to if you've ever had a bottle of wine that you open and then you let it sit around for 6 months and then you go back to it and it doesn't taste good, and you'll notice that the color is more brown than red, same kind of a chemical reaction happening there. Or the difference between a beautiful fresh red grape and a raisin, you'll notice that there's quite a difference in the vitality and the pigments and the flavors. And the same thing happens with elderberry. So something, I do like it dried, but once you've made it into some kind of an extract, having it relatively promptly is better. And having a little bit of sweetener in it helps stabilize those pigments a little bit better. So let's see, what else do I want to say here? I do want to address the cytokine storm thing. And, there's a lot we still don't fully know and understand about everything. But with cytokine storm, this is something that has been postulated. So when cytokines are immune compounds that are often inflammatory, though not always, and they're an important part of the immune system. But if they get out of hand, they can make us feel pretty cruddy. And in some of the more advanced states of COVID, we think that part of the problem is the immune system over response to infection with the cytokine storm that ends up causing damage and putting people in a more deadly state with COVID. And is it the 1819 flu or whatever that 1912 flu, whatever the year that the swine flu came out. So, that's the concern, is that possibly elderberry might be enhancing cytokines. And as a postulation from that is maybe it would actually be problematic in COVID. And there's really no evidence of it. That all that concern came from was a lab study that they did on human tissue. And they found that there was a slight increase in cytokine activity, and that people got better because they had human studies. And then they also were testing things in culture, like lab tests. So the cytokine thing was something they saw in the lab, but they also noticed that in people that they got better with the cold or the flu. And so their thought was that maybe part of the reason why elderberry was working was because of this slight uptick in the cytokines to help strengthen the immune system response against an infection. And certainly in COVID, we do have this funny balance to play where we want the immune system to respond and help fight the infection, but we don't want the immune system to over respond. But there has been no evidence that elderberry exacerbates a more dangerous cytokine storm. And usually if somebody gets to a state of cytokine storm, like that's in a much more advanced state of illness and when they're like in the hospital on their last legs. So it's not the situation that people would even be at home taking elderberry. It's not likely. And herbalists as a whole are not seeing elderberry make outcomes come worse with COVID and other infections when they take elderberry. Usually they're seeing a benefit. So I personally don't think it's likely. And most herbalists I find feel the same way about it. And I go into the studies and show you where all that origin came from, but on that blog post, but I don't think it's a concern. And regardless, the timing of those things are very different. So usually the elderberry is really, it's not that it's dangerous later, but that it's most appropriate in the early stages. So that's what it's going to do its best job. So I'm going to take a quick moment and just see, does anybody have any questions or comments?
Maria, I just wanted to let you know you were talking about the time a little bit earlier. We're okay on time. We don't have the follow-up guest lecture. So if you run a little bit over, we're fine with that.
Okay, good. I meant to ask that earlier. That's good to know. I think we probably will be good because I was, 2 hours. I often do this in less than 2 hours, but having 2 hours gives us a little bit more flexibility. And we're aiming to go till 4, right? That was our.
Yes.
Okay. I think we should be able to wrap it up by 4, but if we need to go further, it's good to know that we have that flexibility. So does anybody have any questions or comments about anything that we've discussed so far? hopefully we're feeling kind of empowered by all of these different options for remedies and herbs. The research on elderberry is pretty good. It has been studied on cold and flu in humans in small studies. They're just a handful of small studies, but the outcomes were pretty good. They were studies that were generally funded by companies that make elderberry syrup. So that's something to take with a grain of salt. There is a little bit of research underway, as far as I'm aware right now, for some clinical trials on COVID, but there are no results yet. And there have been some lab studies. And of course, this like lab studies to me are not really all that valuable to us, but there have been some lab studies on other coronaviruses showing that it had similar benefits for binding to those viral infections and making them less likely to be able to break into cells. So it does suggest that elderberry is probably similarly beneficial in coronaviruses, but we really don't know for sure. There haven't been any human studies on coronaviruses, and there have been 0 completed studies at this point in time on COVID and elderberry specifically. So here's the recipe that I personally really love. It's from Darcy Blue, and it's very simple to make. And that's one of the things I really like about it, because, you know, even if you have access to fresh elderberries, the seasons might be very short, or maybe one year is better than others. So I love that it uses dry ingredients, which are going to be easier to get. You don't necessarily need to have a fresh bush of elderberries in front of you to do this. And you'll be using some combination of elderberries, elderflowers, ginger chips, which is just like your cut and sifted dried ginger root, or you can use fresh ginger root, works too, and some cinnamon chips or cinnamon sticks. If you use cinnamon powder, it gets really slimy and gloppy. So that's why we're using cinnamon chips or cinnamon sticks, so it doesn't get quite so mucilaginous and slimy, and doesn't look like somebody blew their nose in your syrup. That's not very pleasant. So, and then you make kind of like a strong tea with hot water, and then add some alcohol to it to add some extra extraction from the alcohol and also help preserve it. And then you let that sit for about a day, strain it out, and then you can add a little bit of lemon and some raw honey. And usually you're going to want an equal amount of honey to bring it up to like half and half, the syrup and the honey. Mix it all together. Tastes really good, and it will be pretty shelf stable. I store my extras in the fridge or freezer, but it is relatively shelf stable on the counter as well. And you could take anywhere from 1/2 to 1 teaspoon. You could take it daily as a preventative, but more often I'd have folks use it when they think they might be exposed. You know, like my husband came home from work with COVID. There's only so much you can do with masks and ventilation when you're working in a manhole with somebody with COVID. And so he's now on his section of the house and I'm on mine. And we were both doing lots of elderberry syrup, because last I got tested, I was negative. I'm a little scratchy now, so hopefully I'm staying negative. I'm now sleeping with the dog, so I might also just have a little bit of allergies to her. But definitely one that in our household has been really, really useful. I have another personal story with elderberry with my husband again. And we were traveling in Italy with friends, and we're not, we don't have kids and I work from home. So we're just not exposed to all the like day-to-day germs that kids have. And so we went to go visit our friend and her 4 children and husband. And not surprisingly, like half of them were sick the whole time that we visited them. And we had our 2 days that we weren't with the friends and the 4 kids to travel around Italy. So we were traveling around Cinque Terre. And as soon as we get there, Shannon comes down with like chills and just like more sick than I had probably almost ever seen him. And I didn't have a chance to make a big bottle of elderberry syrup before I left. So I think I had like 1.5 ounces that I brought with us. So he took it and immediately, like within an hour or so, was like, wow, I feel a lot better. And then he could feel it creep back after an hour, another hour or two. And he took it a couple times. And by the next day, which was good because we really wanted to enjoy our few days that we had without the family, he was feeling much better. And then I got it. And unfortunately, I no longer had elderberry syrup because he had used all my elderberry syrup. But eventually I found some elderberry syrup on the market at the Abocca Museum in Italy, but it was not as good as the one that I make myself with Darcy's recipe. But
Maria,
for him,
can I
yes,
ask you something about this recipe? So you're not boiling them, you're not decocting it at all, right? So this is completely infused.
yes, yep, it's just an infusion. So it's kind of like you make a tea, and then you add a little alcohol to it, and then you strain it out the next day and then add your honey. So it's very easy to make, and it's not simmered at all, but we are using dry elderberries. I wouldn't use fresh ones for this.
If you didn't have 100 proof alcohol, if you had vodka or something like this, how would you go about that?
So you could still do it with 80 proof. It just might not be as shelf stable, or you could maybe bump up the alcohol a little bit. So maybe do like 3 ounces of boiling water and 3 ounces of the 80 proof alcohol. And I haven't done the math, but that should get you pretty close to a similar final alcohol percent. And so that would be another way to get around it too. And there are a lot of recipes out there that don't involve alcohol at all. I just personally really like the way this one comes out, and it's also shelf stable. But this particular recipe has worked well for me, but I can do alcohol, so that makes it easy as well. There is another recipe here that you could do. It doesn't agree with me because my stomach does not love a lot of vinegar. But if you tolerate vinegar and you want something that's shelf stable, you could do a somewhat similar recipe and then use a vinegar and honey base instead of water and alcohol base, and that will be shelf stable as well. And it tastes pretty good too. And that would be an oxymel. And I have a slightly different recipe where I'm doing elderberries, rosehips, and schizandra berries because they just go so nicely together, especially with that vinegar honey base. But you could also use the same herb combo that I recommended in that other recipe, and that would work too. And just to go back to that elderberry story in Italy, that was the time that Shannon became a big believer in elderberry syrup because he was amazed by how dramatically he could feel the difference of it working and how quickly he was able to get over, within a matter of like, I'd say it was probably about 12 hours, he was back and functioning again, which he was very appreciative of. And so was I, even though I felt like crud after that. So always the moral of the story, always bring lots of elderberry syrup with you when you're traveling. So another way that I personally really love to use elderberry is by making it as a tea. And I know Rosalie de la Forêt, who's another herbalist that I adore, often will talk about using elderberry. She actually uses it as a tea more often than she uses it as a syrup. And so you can do a lot of different tea recipes with it, but one that I like is one you could just combine elderberry with hibiscus. And the hibiscus gives it a nice red color and it gives it a little bit more of a fruity flavor. Hibiscus is very sour tasting. And then you can add other ingredients too. So I sometimes will add some schizandra berries, which are one of those deep immune adaptogenic herbs that I mentioned earlier on. You could throw lemon balm in this. One of my students or two of my students formulated a tea that was combined hibiscus and lemon balm and schizandra, and it was really good. And so now I actually combine it with my elderberry mix as well. And then if you happen to have any of the Thai, this is a popular tea from what I understand in Thailand, of butterfly blue pea flower. It adds like a really pretty purpley color to your bluish purple color to your tea. You could include that too if you have it, but you don't need to. Any of those basic ingredients will do. It's very sour, so adding some honey will make it taste a lot better. And then it's really quite yummy and very soothing. So I make it really strong. Definitely been drinking a lot of this lately and have found it to be quite helpful in our household. And it's also one I'll often make in my tea, my to-go tea mug when I'm traveling and just kind of sip throughout conferences and things like that, because I usually get sick in those times and I'm more susceptible. So I'll bring that with me to drink. Another big go-to for mine would be ginger. And this is like super classic. Like so many people use ginger as a supportive, and specifically the fresh ginger root is going to be better here because there's more of an antiviral effect when it's fresh. And we lose some of that once we dry it. So you can still use it dry, but it's going to be even better fresh. I know Stephen Buhner really likes to use the juiced, like he'll juice ginger and get that juice and then mix that with hot water and take it that way. I usually just thin slice it like you see in that picture and throw it in a thermos, or I might grate it, especially if I don't have a thermos and I want something that can, extract a little bit faster. I'll do the fresh grated, and I throw a little bit of lemon, a good amount of honey, and this blends really well with that elderberry tea. So lately that's what I've been doing is I take that initial elderberry tea, but then I also throw a bunch of ginger in it, and that tastes great too. So ginger is going to act as a diaphoretic, so it does help you break a fever. It is also really nice for soothing sore throats. It's anti-inflammatory. It helps discourage bacteria in the gut. So if you have a gastrointestinal infection, ginger will help discourage pathogens while encouraging your good gut flora. It is great for soothing nausea. It is potentially helpful for directly fighting the viral infection. And it's really nice and supportive for the microbiome. So it has a lot of different benefits to it. And that's one of my classics when I'm starting to not feel well is I'll make a big thermos of ginger tea and then just sip that throughout the day and enjoy that. And a lot of herbalists really like using that quite a bit. And I heard a lot of reports from folks, especially early in the pandemic, that was one of the few things that they had to turn to, and that it seemed to really agree with them. Now, not everybody can handle ginger. So, if it's too spicy, then maybe you'll want to turn to other remedies instead that aren't quite so spicy. But if you're somebody who likes ginger, then this is a great way to use it. You could use it as a tea. You could use it in your food. You can also use it in soup broth as well. Like I think there are a lot of really great Thai soups that involve a lot of ginger. And so that would be a great way to also incorporate these herbs into the diet when you're not feeling well. So here's the recipe for that ginger tea that you can refer back to, and combining it with the elder, as I mentioned before.
Have you heard of, Maria,
Go for it.
sorry, have
Yeah.
you heard of people using ginger during the COVID just to suppress the inflammatory mediators?
That's a great question. So you're talking about more come to the idea of COVID being a very inflammatory disease. And I have not heard specifically of people using it that way, but that is another great consideration for why it might be useful, because it is a little bit of a blood thinner, and it is also a really great just kind of systemic anti-inflammatory remedy. And so it may be helpful there too, where we do have COVID being an inflammatory disease of the cardiovascular system as well as the immune system. So it does give it a good reason why it might be helpful. I haven't really heard too much about it there. I know that Andrew, you did a great interview with Andrew Bentley, and I have read over some of his book, his little ebook on COVID. And I'm sure that he talks about using ginger, but I don't remember exactly what he says about it. So he might discuss it more because he is an herbalist that has worked with COVID clients in his practice quite a bit. Whereas I'm more, on various forums, listening to people's stories more than I am actively working as their herbalist on them. Have you heard anything?
It makes sense to me, but I haven't heard anything specifically in practice.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. But I also haven't heard anything specific. And I'm curious too, feel free to plug this in the chat box, since ginger is such a classic thing that a lot of people love. So I'm wondering if you have a favorite way to eat or drink or use ginger, especially fresh ginger, in your own life, any, favorite recipes, and feel free to include that in the chat box as well. We can share that. So lemon balm is an herb that I love. I mean, this is actually one of the first herbs I ever personally started using, and one of my first introductions to herbal medicine, especially like using something from the garden and making medicine with it. And I use it more for its more commonly known uses for uplifting the mood, relaxing, helping people sleep. There's also been quite a lot of cool research regarding cognition and attention and focus. And it's nice because it's relaxing, but it's not overly sedating. And it does have some antiviral effects as well. And most commonly, we think of it around herpes viruses, but probably does to some extent around like the flu virus as well. But most often the research is focused on herpes for that. And it's a nervine, so it supports the nervous system. It does have some anti-inflammatory and cardiovascular tonic benefits, a little bit of blood sugar lowering benefit. But it was Andrew Bentley talking about it being used in COVID that really made me plug it into this particular slideshow, and also, start using it just as we're dealing with COVID in our household, incorporating it into our tea blends there as well. And there are a lot of possible applications. It's a pretty gentle herb, but it's a pretty amazing herb. And it's Jim McDonald, who I think says something to the line of gentle doesn't mean weak, and really like appreciating those gentle herbs for all their nice benefits. So this is a very kid-friendly herb. It's generally very safe for most people, and it could potentially in infections have some benefit, working a little bit as an antiviral. It is a gentle, very mild diaphoretic. and it may ease. I know Andrew has commented in his e-booklet, I was rereading that recently, that he noticed that people get a little bit of a, just even for their COVID symptoms, just a little bit of a reprieve. Things seem to get a little bit better after they've had some lemon balm. And the effects are sometimes temporary, but at least it's giving a little bit of relief. It's also, just as a stress supportive herb, really useful consideration, because especially nowadays where we're not just dealing with the concern about common colds or flus, but there's just so much stress right now because of the pandemic. And if you are infected with it, then you're even more stressed, because not only are you sick, but you're sick with like the big sick. And so having something that may have some immune benefits, but also is addressing the nervous system and the stress side of things as well, can be really helpful. And so I love that idea. And I that's one of the things I really loved about his ebook that he shared, which is linked there. And then I have a slide towards the end as well that mentions it again with a link. I love that the herbs that he chose to focus on were the ones that we as Western herbalists really know and love and appreciate. And so it wasn't a lot of really weird things that you can't buy easily and that we really don't know very well. It was herbs predominantly that we really know and love and appreciate, and him using them in his practice and getting great results with them. And so I really appreciated him for sharing that and for using the herbs in that way. I don't see any ginger recipes posted, so feel free to put some in there. So let's see, anything else? So when I'm using lemon balm, especially for the nervous system, I really love using it as a tincture, and especially as a fresh plant tincture. I think that's one of the strongest ways to use it, but it's also really delightful as a tea. And so it's a great addition as you're making your ginger teas or your respiratory teas or your, elderberry teas. You can easily just throw lemon balm right in there, and it's a great addition. It's not quite as potent once it's dry, but it still does have benefits. So I still do enjoy using it there. And if you have access to get it directly from a farm or from your backyard, it is a lot more effective that way than the big commerce. You can still get it from, I love mountain rose, but usually some of these, best from the farm herbs, I would rather get directly from a farm. So someplace like Zach Woods or Foster Farm Botanicals or someplace like that. But, if all else fails, you can still use, something from traditional medicinals or mountain rose, but you will find that it tastes better. It often will work a little bit better when it's homegrown or freshly grown and carefully dried. There are some concerns. There have been a few people that in studies or whatever, if they have a lot of lemon balm, that it makes them a little bit on the sleepier side. Very variable. You can play around with it and see what works for you. In the studies on cognition and anxiety, it worked within just 1 hour. So you can easily play with your dose and see what works best for you, but maybe try it out on the weekend and not like right before class if you're concerned about feeling sleepy. And it's not likely to bother folks who are hypothyroid. That's something that you'll often see as a caution. And it's good to be aware that there is some research in the lab that suggests that in combination with other herbs, it helped bring down hyperthyroid disease. Pretty subtle for that, but possibly helpful. But I really haven't seen it be a hypothyroid agent where it's taken somebody who's already low thyroid and made them lower. And I've talked to herbalists around the world, and for the most part, I've yet to come across anybody who has seen that happen. So I'm not particularly concerned that lemon balm is going to make somebody with hypothyroid worse. I would just kind of keep it in the back of your mind. So if their thyroid tanked, then maybe look at the lemon balm, but it seems really, really, really unlikely to happen. So I personally have Hashimoto's and I use lemon balm and I don't see any problems with it. And a lot of my clients have hypothyroid and use lemon balm in their protocols, and we haven't seen any issues there. So I see some great ginger recipes. Let me open up my chat box a little bit better so I can see that. So let's see. We've got ginger with mango, pineapple, lemon, and coconut milk as a smoothie. That sounds great. Going light on the ginger because ginger can get pretty overpowering if you do too much of it in the smoothie. Ginger and chai, that's a great way. And chai is a great way to incorporate, all those chai spices and black tea. If you're having black tea in your chai, which is traditional, that those also have their own antimicrobial and immune supportive benefits as well. So that's a great way. And my mom makes her own ginger paste at home, and we use that in our regular cooking recipes. And we use it often when sauteing vegetables. Yeah, that's delicious. And so even for us in our house, I took out, I didn't want to be, I knew that we would be doing lots of ginger tea, and I didn't want to have to be like constantly pulling ginger out to, make new tea every time, multiple times a day. So I just took my ginger and cut it up a little bit, threw it in the blender and pureed it into like this paste. I didn't even bother taking the peel off of it because I was going to be straining it out eventually anyway, but you could take the peel off of it first if you want to. And then I combined it with honey. So that it was like a honey ginger paste. And then I would just take a big scoop of that and use that to make tea in a pinch, since I knew over several days I'd want to be making the same tea over and over again. And that worked quite well. So I have some extra slides in here so we can talk about other ways that we can additionally support our body, especially when it comes to supporting the lungs, cough, mucus, congestion. There are so many, 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 many herbs that we can choose from. So, one of our first categories would be our aromatic herbs. So our aromatic herbs are often antimicrobial. They often help move mucus. We can often use them in teas, steams, syrups, cough drops, cough syrups, tinctures. There are a lot of different ways that we can use them. And so we have the like more traditional mint family antimicrobial herbs like bee balm, which is one of my favorites. That one's more of a garden herb, and it combines the medicine of oregano and thyme in one. But you could also be using regular oregano or regular thyme. Rosemary is one that I don't always think about for the immune system, but that is one that I heard feedback from, again, early in the pandemic when folks didn't have much else at their disposal, when everybody was on lockdown and some people were not feeling well. A lot of folks felt really good throwing thyme into their tea, rosemary in their tea, and also doing steams with rosemary that ended up feeling really nice. Rosemary has a lot of similar energies to eucalyptus, but it's even more tolerable to be taking internally. Sage can be pretty drying. So that is, all these herbs are kind of drying, but sage is really drying. So that's something to keep in mind, because sometimes in COVID, there is a lot of dryness and heat. So you may need to buffer it with some honey or some soothing, slimy herbs like marshmallow, or you may choose a different herb altogether. But sage is a classic for sore throats and coughs. And it is a nice antimicrobial, but it is very dry. And apparently I like rosemary so much that I wrote it on the slide twice. Peppermint, I didn't have it on the slides that I sent out to you guys, and then I realized that it wasn't on there, but peppermint's a great one and a good one for syrups and essential oils to do as an inhaled steam, or to have it in your, the tincture, the like dried peppermint in your tea blends. It's not so much antimicrobial like the others, but it is a good antispasmodic. So that can be really helpful for coughs. Like I love Ricola. That's one of my classic cough drop things that I'll go to. And it's also great in teas because it kind of helps break up mucus, reduce spasms from coughing, and help clear up the sinuses as well. But it's not as antimicrobial as some of the others on this list. The evergreens in general, not all evergreens, but most of the evergreens that are in the pine family specifically tend to be great. So white pine, fir, spruce, balsam fir, some of your classic ones, Korean licorice mint, anise hyssop, which are in the mint family, but they have more of like a fennel type flavor to them. Those are really nice and soothing. Hyssop, holy basil, also known as tulsi, very popular in India and Southeast Asia, and also potentially some parts of Africa use holy basil and various osmum species. And those have some nice immune supportive properties in addition to the adaptogenic benefits and the stress reducing benefits. Balsam root and osha, I don't use so much because they're very specific to certain parts of the United States and they're not very sustainable, but those are classic lung herbs that are very aromatic. Sage, will often use that as a gargle or as a spray for sore throats. And in fact, I have a lovely little throat lozenge here that's got sage as one of the main ingredients. Raw garlic, as much as you can handle. Onion, horseradish, ginger, all those are great too. So those aromatic antimicrobials, all worth considering. I already mentioned most of them. Little extra slide here on pine, especially white pine. And it's also a warming, drying herb. So you want to match the energetics of whether something is, warming or cooling, drying or moistening to what's going on. So if somebody was hot and dry, we'd want to turn at least more to the cooling, moistening remedies, or we'd at least want to buffer some of those hot, dry herbs. So just keep that in mind. Some tips on how to do an herbal steam. And sometimes when I'm using these aromatic herbs as a tea, especially if I've got a lot of sinus or respiratory congestion, I'll make a nice big, mug of it. And as it's steeping, I'll inhale it. And it's even better if you can kind of tent yourself and inhale it. And then once it's done steeping, I'll strain it out and then drink it as a tea. But you could just do a basic steam where you just have a bigger pot. You take it off the heat so that it's not boiling and burning your face. And then you can add handfuls of herbs, or fresh or dry could work, or you could do a few drops of essential oil, just don't go too much, and then tent yourself with a towel over the steam and inhale it. Just make sure that it's not going to burn you. And that's a great way to help clear the sinuses and disinfect it from the outside in. Some of my favorite teas are here in the extra recipes that have a lot of our aromatic herbs, but you will notice that I've kind of buffered them because, we've got peppermint is kind of got its own energy going on. Thyme and bee balm are quite drying, and you could use whatever you have on hand. So if you don't have bee balm, you could use oregano, but I've buffered it with plantain leaf and marshmallow leaf, which are a little bit more soothing and moistening and kind of help offset some of these more dry antimicrobial herbs. It's another sort of similar theme, but it has a little bit more of a cough drop kind of flavor to it. Some of our classic lung opening herbs like peppermint and yerba santa and mullein and pine, and then softening that with some of the plantain leaf. Marshmallow leaf would go in great here too if you wanted to add that. And I think I said everything. I don't know if I mentioned thyme or not. And just another tea that I made up the other day, when we were dealing with sore throats and coughs and things, and we're like, is it allergies to the dog because we're spending a lot more time snuggled up to her, or is it COVID? But regardless, there's congestion and sore throats and scratchiness. And so I made up this tea, and this was really quite yummy. So marshmallow leaf with lemon balm leaf. Marshmallow is a kind of soothing, slimy herb. Lemon balm, we've already talked about. Korean licorice mint is a really nice herb that I love to grow. That is traditional medicine in Korea. We have the anaesisip, which is very closely related and has a little bit more history of use in European and American herbalism, but I like the Korean licorice mint flavor better. And if you don't have access to that, you can use fennel seed or a little bit of licorice root, and they're kind of sort of similar, and they taste sort of similar too. And holy basil, throwing that in there for the stress and the immune support, and it tasted so good, and it was really soothing. And then I also added a little bit of violet leaf in there, which is more for like nutrition and a little bit more soothing and slimy, but it's also a little bit of a lymph and immune herb as well. So all those pungent herbs that we know and love that are antimicrobial and get things moving are great to incorporate into the diet or make syrups with or make infused honeys with. You could even make tea with them. Some folks have recipes that they love to make with like honey and garlic, or honey and ginger, of course, is an easy combo. But even sometimes people will make garlic tea and enjoy it that way. But onions, garlic, ginger, cayenne, horseradish, each one has its own special thing that it does. But basically, as a whole, they're very moving to the mucus, and I can also have some warming effects on the body so that the body is better able to fight off infections, and also can help with clearing that congestion. This is a recipe for fire cider, a basic recipe. And then if you go onto the blog, I have a more specific recipe for fire cider, as well as other yummy sauces and dressings that you can make with your fire. Once you have some fire cider, you can then make other things with it too that are really tasty. But basically, fire cider is a garlic, ginger, hot pepper, garlic, all that good stuff. And then you're combining it with vinegar and honey and using that as an extract. And you can take it by the spoonful, but you can also incorporate it into the diet. Some recipes for cough syrups has bonus slides and glycerin if you want to avoid sugar, but still have something that's kind of soothing and sweet. And then marshmallow is just an herb I wanted to throw in here because it's not so much antimicrobial, but it's nice and moistening and soothing. So when things are dry and irritated and scratchy, or if you're just working with a lot of really dry, hot herbs and you want to balance that formula, marshmallow is one of my favorites. And when you add it to water, it gets this very like slimy, viscous consistency. If you're just using the leaves or the cut and sifted root, it's more velvety in its texture. But if you use the powder, it's actually really like slimy, like the consistency of blowing your nose. And so that can be good or bad depending upon what somebody needs. But it's a really good one to consider, especially when things are dry. And I love using the leaves and or the roots in tea blends. It's just really quite nice addition to other herbs. Some different recipes for making marshmallow, very soothing for the stomach as well. Licorice is not personally one of my go-to herbs, but it is worth mentioning because it is a classic for sore throats. It does have a lot of antiviral benefits. Some folks are using it in their COVID protocols. You do need to be careful because not everybody likes licorice. I'm not a person who loves licorice, which is funny because I do like some other licoricey tasting things like the Korean licorice mint. But so it's not my favorite, but some people do really like it. You do want to be aware that using it in high doses or long-term might raise blood pressure in some people. It can also increase some of the stress hormones, which could be good or bad. It has a little bit of a cortisone-like action, and it can also potentiate steroids and cortisone drugs. What else do I want to say about it? It can also tinker with hormones. It's a little bit of a plant estrogen, and it does have some testosterone lowering effects in all genders. So it's just something else to keep in mind. The DGL form has the glycyrrhizin removed, which makes it much safer, but also a little bit less nuanced. I like to consider it dumber, but so it's not going to be as antiviral in the DGL form, but it is soothing in that form. So those are some other, ways that you consider using licorice. Usually we're just going to use like a little bit of it in a tea blend or in some other recipe. Syrup. Licorice goes nicely in syrups as well. It's very classically used in Ayurveda in India, as well as throughout Chinese medicine and Asian medicine as like a harmonizing synergist, just a little bit in the formula to make it taste good and just kind of bring all the other ingredients together. And sometimes they'll combine it with a little bit of ginger or a little bit of cinnamon for that. Horehound, I threw in a bunch of extra slides here. I think we're going to kind of wrap things up, but horehound's a really great one for moving mucus, and it's most classically used for wet coughs. And I also love using it in allergies and sinus infections and those kinds of things. I personally prefer it as a fresh plant tincture, but you can use it in other formats as well. The cough drops are the main way that they're used. They are a lot weaker that way, but it is nice for coughing. So there are a lot of options there. Wild cherry bark and choke cherry are classically used. We want to use the dry bark, preferably later in the season after it's done flowering. And it has some of those same cyanide-like compounds in it that elderberry do that we want to be a little bit careful about. But once it's dry, it's usually pretty well tolerated, especially in the doses that we're going to be using it. If animals are grazing on, a fresh plant, it can kill animals, but that's because they're like eating it as a food versus the little bit that we'd be taking as medicine. But cherry bark is classic for spastic, dry, irritated coughs. When you've been exposed to a lot of wood smoke or fire smoke, and it's just really irritated, this can help relax that spasm and tension, which can be helpful. And so just another herb to consider. I love it particularly in honey because honey is also soothing and great for coughs as well, and it makes it taste really nice. Nettle, we use it for moving mucus and helping to dry out allergies, acting as a little bit of an antihistamine, especially fresh extracts. It does sting when it's fresh, but if you make it in a tincture or possibly a vinegar, it seems to be potentially helpful for allergies there. Goldenrod, good complement there, really nice herb for moving mucus, and another one that I tend to turn to in sinus infections to helping to drain out some of that excess mucus. Mullein, classic for the respiratory system, soothing and opening the lungs, and we're using the leaves. Just make sure that it's properly identified because it does look a lot like foxglove and comfrey, and foxglove being the really dangerous one. And they look very different once they're in bloom, but if you're just harvesting them in their leafy stage, there are occasionally mix-ups where somebody thinks they're harvesting mullein and they're actually harvesting foxglove, and just one cup of tea will kill you. And it's an old old, very low quality video that I did in my old online course materials. But if you do want to go and check that out, you can check out that link. And right around 4 minutes and 41 seconds in, I visit all 3 of the plants and look at them. But just know that the audio visual quality on that video is pretty bad. I have a newer tincture video out there for my online courses, but I have not had a chance yet to re-record one for these specific 3 plants because foxglove is not on my property anymore. Elecampane is an herb that some folks are using in COVID. It's a classic one for helping to deal with respiratory infections and moving mucus. It is very hot and dry and balsamy in its energies. Lobelia is one that we just use in low doses because high doses is kind of nauseating and vomit inducing. But in low doses, it does seem to help open up the lungs. So some people do find it's useful in these just a few drops of tincture to help open their lungs when they're having a hard time breathing. But keeping in mind that, really, if somebody's having a hard time breathing, that might be the best time for them to go seek medical care, or at least be seeking supervision of medical providers to watch and keep a close eye on them. Don't really use, and for the applications that we're talking about here, I'm really less apt to be using the berberine rich herbs like golden seal and barberry. That's very drying. It is a little bit of an antihistamine. It can be antimicrobial on contact. That is a great consideration for sinus infections to put into like a neti pot, but I don't see it as appropriate with cold and flu and COVID personally, but you might hear other herbalists feel differently. It may work synergistically with certain antibiotics. So if somebody has a bacterial infection and they're using these herbs alongside, it may help the antibiotics work better because it helps prevent the bacteria from becoming as resistant. It helps prevent them from pumping out the antibiotics. So it might have a synergizing effect to antibiotics in their own sort of way. And some pictures of some berberine rich herbs. You see that yellow color, that's the berberine in part. Neti pots can be really great when there's sinus infection and other nasal rinses. And last few slides here, and then we'll wrap things up. So, it's tricky because there's such a variety of quality of herbs on the market, and it can be challenging if you're a new person to know where to get your herbs and how do you ensure that the herbs you're buying are not adulterated or contaminated. And there's no easy answer. I mean, it is illegal to be adulterating and contaminating herbs, but it still happens. And we're going to see even more of it happening now because there's such a pressure on the industry. So many people want herbs and we're starting to exceed the supply that's available. And the supply chain is also challenged by the pandemic because, people are not able to work in the same ways that they were to, grow and harvest and process and ship things to this country. So, first and foremost, I think looking for companies that are run by herbalists, some of our bigger companies and many of our smaller companies are herbalist run and have a real goal of that authenticity to the herbs and really understand and value the plants. You can also ask for a certificate of analysis. Some companies are good at providing those, like Mountain Rose Herbs is a company that's very good about providing COAs or certificates of analysis when you ask for it. You can also choose certified organic herbs whenever possible. And usually those are going to be better quality. And usually those are going to be cultivated, but that's not always the case. But as a general rule of thumb, you're usually better off. And then if you can get it from the United States, or depending upon what country you're in, if you're in another country, you might have a really nice farm local to you that would be an even better option. But if you're in the United States, getting your herbs directly from a United States farm, United States organic farm, can be even better and get really nice quality that way. And if you can buy herbs in more whole form, so that could be cut and sifted instead of powdered, it's a lot easier for powders to degrade in their quality, and it's also a lot easier to adulterate pulped powders or to put low quality ingredients in a powdered format. So getting things more whole or at least cut and sifted can be nice. Using your senses, even for something like elderberry, you'll get variants from batch to batch that what you get, but the ones that have a nice deep purple color are going to work better than, an elderberry that you get that's basically brown. Once you get it, it should be like a deep blue purple kind of color. Or, does that peppermint still have a nice strong aroma? It's going to work better than one that's been dusty and sitting around and has lost lots of its peppermintiness. If you can get something that's been recently harvested, that's great. You don't always have that control as a purchaser, but that's ideal. And then if you can grow and harvest your own, that's phenomenal if you have access to it. But I'm guessing many of you might be in the city and may not have easy access to growing your own, but something to keep in mind if you do have opportunity. And here's just a slide with a lot of my favorite companies. We've got small to medium-sized United States farms and local herb shops. For those of you guys who are in the Boston area, Cambridge Naturals is amazing and does a really great job sourcing great quality dried herbs as well as products. So that's a good place to check out. If you are in the New Hampshire area, especially really close to University of New Hampshire, Misty Meadows is probably the best herb shop in the whole state of New Hampshire, and their quality is phenomenal. They do also ship, and not all, but many of the dried herbs and remedies that they make are from their farm, which I really appreciate. And they're just very good with their quality. They're not the cheapest place to get your herbs, but they are one of the better quality places. And then there's some other great herb shops around. Your natural food stores and co-ops are usually pretty decent. There's some online distributors that are more internationally sourced. And of those, I'd say Mountain Rose Herbs is the one that I tend to trust the most because I know that their quality and identity testing is pretty phenomenal. And then there are big brands. So brands like Gaia and Herb Farm and Oregon's Wild Harvest, Herbalist and Alchemist, Wise Woman Herbals, Avena Botanicals, possibly Mega Food. That's more of a supplement company. But those are some really excellent, good quality companies that make ready to go formulas. And I should have it on there, but also Urban Moonshine is another really nice company. They mostly sell bitters, but they do have some nice immune and other formulas as well. When you store your herbs, keeping them in a cool, dark, dry spot for dry herbs is best. And all your shelf-stable herbs, those are best, herbal remedies. So like a tincture, cool, dark, dry spot, like a pantry or a cabinet can be really nice for those. If it's something like a syrup or a vinegar extract, especially of a fresh herb, some of these are not as shelf-stable. So storing them in the fridge or the freezer can be a little bit better for long-term stability, especially. And just some general doses are on this slide. But, when it comes to working with cold and flu, a lot of times we're working with higher doses and more frequent doses just because of the acute nature of that situation. And I do have on my blog more details on how to make almost all of these things. And then just that reminder, listen to your body. If you're taking elderberry for a cold or mushrooms, you should feel better. And you should not feel worse. So if you're feeling worse with those remedies, it's probably a sign that it's not the right thing for you. And I would listen to that. The one possible exception would be that if you're using a diaphoretic and you've got a fever, you might notice that you feel kind of like hot and sweaty, because that's the point of it, before the fever breaks. But usually you'll feel feeling better within a couple hours or so. But, just listen to your body and make sure that the herbs that you're choosing are agreeing with you and are also hopefully having an impact. If you're in an acute state and you're taking herbs, hopefully within that day, you're starting to feel better. If you're not, then the herbs might not be the right choices for you, or you may require some more medical interventions. Various links to resources, mostly of mine, but not entirely of mine. So we've got recipes and blog posts, that elderberry blog, a lung herb thing, a whole podcast on the lungs and herbs, mushroom ebook. There's a American Herbalist Guild has a really nice COVID-19 resource page. And then Andrew Bentley, which you might already be aware of, his podcast that he did on Plant Love Radio, as well as his really nice ebook on herbs and COVID. And then this is just on some of the theoretical studies that have been done on herbs and supplements and diet and lifestyle with COVID. It's all been pretty much theoretical at this point. So just researchers saying, here's this data out there on these herbs, and then here's what we know about COVID. So these things would probably work well together. So it's not necessarily studies that have been done on, like clinical trials, but there are quite a few studies that are out there looking at some of these same things that we just talked about. And I bolded some of the ones that I thought were the nicer studies. So you can check those out if you want to. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us. That was fabulous.
Awesome. Thank you. And I hope you all stay well. And if you don't, you have some tools in your toolkit to hopefully feel a little bit better.
Thank you. Thank you so much.